All right, let's dive deep into the chilling and tragic case of Holly Bobo, a case that shook not only a small town in Tennessee, but the entire nation. It all began on the morning of April 13th, 2011. Just another seemingly ordinary day in the quiet community of Darden, Tennessee, where crime was rare and neighbors knew each other well. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where parents let their kids roam free without a second thought. But on that fateful morning, everything changed. Holly Bobo was a bright and ambitious 20-year-old nursing student at the University of Tennessee at Martin's Parsons Center. She had dreams of making a difference in people's lives, of dedicating her career to helping others. She was beautiful, kind-hearted, and deeply loved by her friends and family. Her parents, Dana and Karen Bobo, adored her, and her older brother, Clint, was her protector, her confidant, her friend. That morning, Holly had an important test at school, so she was up early. By 4:30 a.m., she was already preparing for the day. She texted her boyfriend, Drew Scott, who was out turkey hunting nearby. Everything was normal. There were no signs, no warnings, nothing to indicate that in just a few hours, her life would take a horrifying turn. At around 7:30 a.m., Holly was still at home, getting ready. Her mother, Karen, had already left for work, and her father, Dana, had left earlier as well. Clint, her brother, was still in bed, half asleep. Then, something happened that no one could have expected. A neighbor, who lived just a short distance away, suddenly heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the direction of the Bobo house. It was loud. It was panicked. It was desperate. The kind of scream that stops you in your tracks, that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Concerned, the neighbor called his mother, who then called Karen Bobo at work. Karen immediately felt something was wrong. A mother's intuition, perhaps. She quickly dialed home, and Clint, still groggy, answered the phone. She asked if Holly was okay. Confused, Clint got up and looked outside. That's when he saw them. From the window, Clint spotted Holly in the yard. She wasn't alone. She was with a man dressed head to toe in camouflage. At first, Clint didn't panic. He thought it was Drew, Holly's boyfriend. Maybe they were having a disagreement. Maybe they were just talking. But something wasn't right. Clint kept watching, trying to make sense of what was happening. Holly and the man seemed to be in a tense conversation. He couldn't hear every word, but he distinctly heard Holly say, "No, why?" There was fear in her voice. There was hesitation. That's when it clicked. This wasn't Drew. This wasn't normal. Something was horribly, terribly wrong. Karen, still on the phone, told Clint to grab a gun, to do something. But Clint, still unsure, hesitated. By the time he rushed outside, Holly and the man were gone. Just like that. Gone. His heart pounded as he scanned the area. That's when he saw it, the blood. In the garage. Fresh blood. Holly's blood. Panic set in. He grabbed the phone and called 911. Within minutes, authorities arrived. The search began almost immediately, but there were no clear answers. No obvious leads. Holly had vanished, seemingly into thin air. Investigators pieced together what little they had. The evidence suggested Holly had been taken into the dense woods behind their home. But beyond that, the trail went cold. Her belongings, including her lunchbox, were found discarded in various locations, as if someone had tossed them out carelessly while moving her from place to place. Her cell phone, the one she had used to talk to her boyfriend just hours earlier, pinged towers in a direction away from her home, showing that whoever had taken her was moving. Fast. The community sprang into action. Hundreds of volunteers searched the woods, combing through miles of rugged terrain, hoping to find anything that could lead them to Holly. But days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And months turned into years. It was as if she had disappeared into the void. No trace. No sightings. Nothing. The family held on to hope. They refused to give up. They pleaded with the public, offering rewards, begging for any information that could bring their daughter home. But there were no answers. Only pain. Only silence. For 3 long years, the question lingered. What happened to Holly Bobo? And who took her? But the truth? The truth was darker than anyone could have imagined. And when it finally came out, it would shock everyone to their core. It was just another quiet morning in Darden, Tennessee, a place where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. But on April 13th, 2011, something did happen, something that would haunt the Bobo family forever. It was early, around 7:30 a.m., when Clint Bobo, Holly's older brother, was slowly waking up. He wasn't fully alert yet, just lying in bed, barely aware of what was going on outside. He had no idea that within minutes, his sister's life would be in unimaginable danger. The morning had started like any other. Holly was up early, preparing for her nursing school exams. She had texted her boyfriend, Drew, and was getting ready to leave for class. But then, something happened, something strange, something terrifying. A neighbor just down the road heard a scream coming from the Bobo property. A loud, panic scream that sent chills down their spine. The kind of scream that instantly tells you something is very, very wrong. The neighbor's mother, concerned, called Holly's mother, Karen, at work. Karen's heart dropped. Something was off. She immediately picked up the phone and called home. It was Clint who answered. She asked him if Holly was okay. Now, Clint was still groggy, not yet aware of the situation. But hearing the urgency in his mother's voice, he got up, walked over to the window, and looked outside. And that's when he saw them. There in the yard was Holly. But she wasn't alone. She was with a man dressed in full camouflage. At first, Clint wasn't alarmed. It was turkey hunting season, and Holly's boyfriend, Drew, was an avid hunter. Maybe it was him. Maybe they were just talking. But something about it didn't feel right. He watched as the man and Holly stood near her car. They weren't just chatting. It was different. The way Holly was standing, the way she was speaking, there was tension. She looked nervous. She looked afraid. Clint strained to hear what was being said. That's when he heard Holly's voice, shaky, uncertain. No, why? It was such a simple phrase. Just 2 words. But the way she said them sent a shiver down his spine. She wasn't just asking a question. She was pleading. Still, Clint hesitated. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was Drew, and they were having an argument. He didn't want to overreact. He didn't want to accuse someone of something when he wasn't even sure what was going on. But at the same time, his gut was telling him something was wrong. While he was still watching from the window, his mother was still on the phone. She sensed the hesitation in Clint's voice. She knew something wasn't right. So she told him, firmly, get a gun. Those words snapped him into reality. His mother was afraid. The neighbor had heard a scream. And now, Holly was outside with a man who didn't look friendly. He rushed to grab a weapon. But by the time he made it back to the window, they were moving. The man was leading Holly away from the house, walking her toward the edge of the property, toward the woods. Clint's mind was racing. What was happening? Where was she going? If this was Drew, why would they be heading into the woods like that? And why did Holly sound so scared? Then it hit him. That wasn't Drew. Panic surged through him as he realized what was happening right before his eyes. Someone was taking his sister. Right there, in broad daylight. He rushed outside, but they were gone. The woods. They had disappeared into the thick, dense trees behind their home. His heart was pounding now. He ran toward where they had been, scanning the ground, looking for any sign of where they went. That's when he saw it. Blood. In the garage on the ground. Fresh. His sister's blood. His mind couldn't process it fast enough. 1 second, she was there. The next, she was being led away by a stranger. And now there was blood. He ran back inside and grabbed the phone. Dialed 911. His voice was frantic as he tried to explain what had just happened. His sister had been taken. She was gone, and there was blood. Within minutes, officers arrived. The search began, but there was no sign of Holly, no sign of the man in camouflage. It was as if they had disappeared into thin air. Clint couldn't stop replaying the moment in his head. Why hadn't he reacted sooner? Why had he hesitated? If he had gone outside right away, could he have stopped it? Could he have saved her? The guilt weighed on him for years. He was the last person to see Holly before she vanished. The last person to see her alive, being led away into the woods by a man who meant her harm. And the worst part? He never saw her again. After Holly Bobo was led into the woods by a man in camouflage, the search for her began immediately. Law enforcement officers, volunteers, and members of the community sprang into action, scouring the dense forests, back roads, and fields surrounding the Bobo home in hopes of finding any clue that could lead them to her. At first, there was nothing. No sign of Holly. No sign of her abductor. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. But then, little by little, evidence began to surface. One of the first discoveries was Holly's lunchbox. It was found discarded near a creek, miles from her home. It was an eerie discovery because it meant someone had taken it from her. Holly wouldn't have just tossed her lunchbox away. She had packed it that morning, preparing for her school day. Whoever had taken her had carried it with them for a time before dumping it. Then, another item was found. Her phone. Authorities tracked the last known signals from Holly's cell phone and found that it had pinged from a series of locations, heading north from her home before abruptly stopping. They knew the phone had been turned off or destroyed, but before that happened, it had traveled a considerable distance. It was a critical clue. It meant that Holly had been moved. Fast. Volunteers and law enforcement combed through the areas near those last known cell phone pings, hoping to find the device itself or something else that could tell them where Holly had gone. And then, finally, someone found it, her actual phone, along with her SIM card and pieces of her belongings. They had been tossed away, left behind, possibly in a hurry. It was clear that her abductor had tried to get rid of anything that could be traced back to them. But why throw her phone away? Had Holly been fighting back? Had she tried to use it? Had the abductor panicked, fearing it could be tracked? Or worse, had Holly been alive when it was discarded, meaning she was still out there somewhere, without a way to call for help? More items surfaced as the days went on. A piece of clothing, a scrap of paper with handwriting on it, even a part of a car seat cover, something that at the time didn't seem significant but later would be tied back to the suspects. Each discovery was both a relief and a nightmare for Holly's family. It meant there were answers out there, but it also meant Holly had been taken far from home, her things discarded along the way like someone trying to erase her existence. Search parties expanded their radius, moving further into the woods and down remote dirt roads. People in the town checked their barns, their sheds, their abandoned properties. A massive search effort was underway, unlike anything this quiet Tennessee town had ever seen before. The discoveries painted a chilling picture. Holly had been moved. Her items were spread out over a large area, which meant whoever took her had been on the move for hours. And then, suddenly, everything stopped. The trail went cold. No more cell pings. No more discarded items. No more signs of life. The community refused to give up. For days, weeks, and months, they searched. They held on to hope that somewhere Holly was still alive, that maybe she had been left somewhere waiting to be found. But as time passed, the harsh reality began to settle in. The more personal items they found, the more it became clear Holly wasn't just missing. She had been taken by someone who didn't intend to bring her back. As the search for Holly Bobo continued, law enforcement officers were under immense pressure to find answers. The small town of Darden, Tennessee, was gripped with fear. How could a young woman be taken from her own home in broad daylight? leaving behind only scattered evidence and a trail that quickly went cold. The investigators knew that if they didn't act fast, they might never find Holly. From the beginning, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, TBI, and local authorities had one major theory. Whoever had taken Holly was likely someone familiar with the area. Someone who knew the back roads, the dense woods, and the isolated locations where she might have been hidden. They needed to start looking at anyone in the area with a criminal history, particularly those with violent tendencies. That's when the name Terry Britt surfaced. Terry Britt was a known name in the community, and not for good reasons. He was a convicted sex offender with a disturbing past. He had a history of stalking women, breaking into homes, and harassing young women around town. He was the kind of person who made people uneasy, someone who seemed capable of something terrible. Almost immediately, investigators zeroed in on him as a possible suspect. His criminal record alone made him a person of interest, but there was more than just his past that made him suspicious. He had a habit of prowling around the area where Holly lived, often making inappropriate comments to women or showing up in places he didn't belong. There were even reports from young women in the community who had encountered him and felt unsafe. As investigators began digging deeper into his life, they realized there was something else: his physical appearance. Terry Britt was known for wearing camouflage. It was something he did regularly, blending into his surroundings almost like a hunter. And Clint Bobo, Holly's brother, had described seeing Holly being led into the woods by a man dressed in full camouflage. Could it have been Terry Britt? Authorities quickly moved in. They interrogated Britt, trying to gauge his reaction. They searched his property, looking for any sign of Holly, any evidence that might link him to her disappearance. They checked his phone records, his whereabouts that morning, every little detail that could either confirm or dismiss their suspicions. Britt, for his part, denied everything. He insisted he had nothing to do with Holly's disappearance. He claimed he was at home that morning, going about his normal routine. And frustratingly for investigators, they struggled to find anything that definitively placed him at the crime scene. There were no eyewitnesses who saw him with Holly. No DNA, no fingerprints, no physical evidence tying him to her disappearance. Despite their strong suspicions, the investigators found themselves hitting a wall. They kept pushing, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he would slip up. But Terry Britt never confessed. He never gave them anything they could use to charge him. Eventually, law enforcement had to face a harsh reality. Without concrete evidence, they couldn't hold him. He remained a person of interest, but he was never officially charged with anything related to Holly's case. This led to widespread frustration in the community. Many believed that Britt was the one responsible, that the police had let the prime suspects slip through their fingers. Holly's family, desperate for answers, wanted more to be done. They wanted justice. But as time passed and more information came to light, a disturbing truth began to emerge. Terry Britt may not have been the right suspect after all. Years later, when new leads surfaced and new suspects were identified, investigators started to believe that they had gone down the wrong path in those early days. While Britt was undeniably a dangerous man, it seemed that he wasn't the one who had taken Holly. The real culprits had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. For 3 long years, Holly Bobo's family lived in agony. They had no answers, no closure, only the pain of not knowing what had happened to their daughter. The case had gone cold despite the massive search efforts, despite the evidence found, despite the suspicions cast on various individuals. But in 2014, a breakthrough finally came, and it was a shocking one. A confession, seemingly out of nowhere, would change the course of the investigation forever. That confession came from a man named Dylan Adams. Dylan was the younger brother of Zach Adams, a name that would soon become central to the case. Dylan was known around town as someone who was a little slow, someone who had trouble processing things the way others did. Some described him as easily manipulated, someone who could be pressured into things. But none of that changed the fact that when he finally spoke up, what he revealed was horrifying. It all started when Dylan Adams was arrested on an unrelated weapons charge. He was taken into custody, and while he was being questioned, the topic of Holly Bobo came up. Investigators knew that Dylan had connections to some of the men they had long suspected in the case, and they hoped that maybe, just maybe, he knew something. And then he said it. He told investigators that he had seen Holly, not just on the news, not just in missing person flyers, but in person. After she was taken, Dylan claimed that sometime after her abduction, he had gone to his brother Zach's house, and when he got there, he saw her. Holly Bobo, the missing young woman the entire state of Tennessee had been searching for, was in his brother's home. It was a bombshell revelation. After years of dead ends, here was someone saying they had seen Holly after she disappeared. This wasn't just a theory anymore. This was real. Dylan described what he had witnessed in horrifying detail. Holly had been there, alive but restrained. She was terrified, crying, helpless. She had been taken against her will, and now she was in the hands of men who meant her harm. Investigators pressed him for more details. Who was there? What happened to her? Dylan, shaken, continued. He told them that he had seen Holly tied up and that Zach and another man, Jason Autry, had been involved. He didn't know every detail of what had happened to her, but he knew she was there, and that alone was enough to send a chill down the spine of everyone listening. With this confession, investigators finally had the lead they had been waiting for. They immediately set their sights on Zach Adams, who had already been on their radar for suspicious behavior. Zach had a history of drug use and violence. He was known for being unpredictable, dangerous even. And now, with his own brother placing Holly inside his house, he became the prime suspect in the case. But there was one problem. Dylan's confession was only part of the puzzle. He had placed Holly in Zach's home, but he hadn't said what happened next. Did she leave? Was she moved? Was she still alive after he saw her? Investigators needed more. They pressed Dylan further, and slowly, more details started to emerge. Dylan wasn't just saying he had seen Holly. He was saying he had heard conversations, discussions about what was going to happen to her, discussions that indicated Holly was never going to be allowed to leave. Authorities knew they needed to act fast. If Dylan was telling the truth, then they had finally found the men responsible for Holly's disappearance. They needed more evidence, more witnesses, more confessions, and they were about to get them. With Dylan's statement in hand, investigators began rounding up others connected to Zach Adams. They started questioning Jason Autry, another man Dylan had mentioned, and they pushed Zach himself, hoping he would crack. It wasn't long before the horrifying truth began to unfold. Dylan's confession had been the key that finally unlocked the case. What happened to Holly Bobo was more horrific than anyone had imagined, and the men responsible had been hiding in plain sight for years. The confession changed everything. It led to arrests, charges, and ultimately, justice for Holly. But it also confirmed the nightmare her family had feared all along. Holly hadn't just vanished. She had suffered. She had been taken to a place where evil awaited her, and Dylan Adams had seen it with his own eyes. For years, the Bobo family had lived in a tormenting limbo, desperate for answers, but finding only dead ends. Holly had vanished in broad daylight, leaving behind only fragments of evidence, whispers of possible suspects, and endless speculation. Investigators had chased lead after lead, but nothing had ever been enough to break the case wide open. Then, in 2014, everything changed. A confession had come from an unexpected source, Dylan Adams, the younger brother of Zach Adams. And what he revealed led directly to a series of arrests that finally put names and faces to the horror that had taken Holly. The moment Dylan Adams confessed to seeing Holly alive after her abduction, investigators knew they were on the verge of something big. He hadn't just made vague statements. He had placed her inside his brother's home, terrified and restrained. He had identified others involved, including Zach Adams and Jason Autry, and that meant law enforcement finally had the names they needed. But getting a confession was one thing. Building a case that could lead to arrests and convictions was another. They needed more. Investigators immediately turned their focus to Zach Adams. He had been a suspect before, someone with a history of violence, a reputation for drug use, and an unpredictable, aggressive nature. He had even bragged about hurting people in the past, and now, with his brother's confession, authorities believed he was at the center of what had happened to Holly. Zach, however, wasn't the only one they were looking at. Dylan had also mentioned Jason Autry, a man with his own criminal record and a long history of run-ins with the law. Jason was someone investigators had suspected but never had enough evidence to charge. That was about to change. With Dylan's statements in hand, law enforcement moved quickly. They weren't going to let any of these men slip through the cracks. The first arrest was Zach Adams. On February 28, 2014, authorities swarmed his home. Officers in tactical gear moved in, making sure he had no chance to run. Zach was taken into custody, and as news of his arrest spread, the town of Darden let out a collective breath. For the first time in 3 years, it felt like justice might finally be on its way. But investigators weren't stopping there. Next, they arrested Jason Autry, another key player in the case. Jason was a career criminal, known for his involvement in drug trafficking and other illegal activities. When authorities got to him, they knew they had another piece of the puzzle locked down. The arrest didn't stop with Zach and Jason. Another name soon entered the picture: Shane Austin. Shane was a close associate of Zach Adams and had been involved in the events surrounding Holly's disappearance. He was offered immunity in exchange for his cooperation, but before he could testify, he took his own life, ensuring that whatever he knew would die with him. As more information surfaced, investigators also arrested Dylan Adams, despite the fact that he had initially been the one to confess. His involvement was still unclear. Was he an active participant, or had he simply been a witness too afraid to speak up? Regardless, he was now entangled in the legal proceedings, charged alongside his brother and Jason Autry. With these arrests, the case had finally cracked wide open. The story that began to emerge was horrifying. Holly had been kidnapped, assaulted, and ultimately murdered. The men responsible had hidden in plain sight, thinking they had gotten away with their crimes. But now they were in custody, facing the full weight of the justice system. For Holly's family, the arrests were a moment of both relief and devastation. They had waited so long for answers, and now they were coming. But those answers confirmed their worst fears. Holly had not survived. The men who took her had done things too terrible to comprehend. As the arrests were made public, the community was stunned. People who had once thought the case might never be solved now saw the faces of the men accused of one of the most brutal crimes in Tennessee's history. The trial was still ahead. The full story was yet to be told. But with Zach Adams, Jason Autry, Dylan Adams, and others now behind bars, one thing was certain. Justice was finally catching up with the people who had stolen Holly Bobo's life. For 3 agonizing years, the Bobo family had lived in uncertainty. Holly had vanished in broad daylight, taken from the safety of her own home, and despite the countless searches, investigations, and even arrests, one thing remained painfully absent: Holly herself. There was no body, no remains, nothing to confirm beyond a shadow of a doubt what had happened to her. But that changed in September 2014, when a discovery by a group of hunters finally brought an answer no one wanted to hear. It was an ordinary day for the three men out in the woods of Decatur County, Tennessee. They were out scouting for ginseng, a valuable plant that grows in the deep forests of the South. It was supposed to be just another day, walking through the dense brush, searching the ground, enjoying the stillness of nature. But then one of them noticed something unusual. Bones. At first, they weren't sure what they were looking at. It could have been an animal. The woods were full of remains left behind by nature. But as they moved closer, their hearts sank. These weren't just any bones. These were human. Panic set in. The hunters immediately contacted authorities, knowing they had stumbled upon something significant. Within hours, investigators arrived at the scene. The area was deep in the woods, secluded, far from any main roads or houses. Whoever had left these remains there had done so intentionally, hoping they would never be found. The forensic teams moved carefully, collecting every piece of evidence, every fragment of bone, every possible clue that could identify who this person had been. But deep down, everyone already had the same sinking feeling. This had to be Holly Bobo. It took days for forensic experts to analyze the remains, but when the results came back, the nightmare was confirmed. The remains belonged to Holly. The news shattered the Bobo family. For years, they had clung to the smallest hope that maybe, somehow, Holly was still alive. Maybe she had been taken somewhere, held against her will, but waiting to be found. Maybe there was still a chance to bring her home. But now that hope was gone. When investigators examined the remains, they made a chilling discovery. A piece of Holly's skull had a gunshot wound. She had been executed. This discovery solidified everything investigators had been piecing together. Holly had been abducted, held captive for hours, maybe even longer. She had suffered at the hands of men who had no mercy, no regard for her life. And when they were done, they had taken her deep into the woods, shot her, and left her body to decay, believing no one would ever find her. But they were wrong. The discovery of Holly's remains changed everything. Up until that point, the case had been built on confessions, witness statements, and circumstantial evidence. Now, there was proof, solid, undeniable proof that Holly had been murdered. For her family, it was the confirmation they never wanted but had long feared. Their daughter, their sister, their friend was never coming home. The girl with the bright smile and kind heart had spent her final moments in terror, and the people responsible had gone on living their lives as if nothing had happened. The community mourned. Vigils were held. People who had once held onto the hope that Holly would return now faced the grim reality that she had been gone all along. But with that grief also came a renewed determination. If there was any doubt before, now there was none. Holly had been murdered, and the men responsible had to pay. Her remains were the final piece of evidence needed to bring the full weight of justice crashing down on those who had taken her. The trial was coming, and with it, the truth of what had really happened to Holly Bobo. For years, the truth about what had happened to Holly Bobo had remained buried beneath layers of fear, lies, and silence. Investigators had arrested multiple suspects, Zach Adams, Dylan Adams, and Jason Autry, but even with the confessions and the remains being found, there were still unanswered questions. What exactly had happened to Holly in her final hours? Who was responsible for what? And who, among the men involved, would break first? The answer to that last question turned out to be Jason Autry. Jason Autry was a career criminal, known for his involvement in drug trafficking, theft, and violent offenses. He had spent most of his life in and out of prison, a man who lived on the fringes of society. But despite his hardened exterior, when faced with the possibility of life in prison, or worse, the death penalty, Jason made a choice that would change everything. He decided to talk. When Autry took the stand in 2017 during Zach Adams' trial, the courtroom was silent. Everyone knew this was going to be the moment that finally revealed the horrifying details of Holly's final moments. And when Jason began to speak, his words painted a picture of brutality so shocking that it left even seasoned prosecutors shaken. Autry testified that on the morning of April 13th, 2011, he had gone to Zach Adams' house, expecting nothing more than a typical drug deal. Zach and his younger brother, Dylan, were known for selling methamphetamine, and Jason had come by to get high, just as he had done countless times before. But when he arrived that day, what he found was far from a normal drug run. There inside the house was Holly Bobo. She was wrapped in a blanket, barely moving. Jason described how, at first, he thought she was already dead, but then he saw her foot twitch. She was alive, barely, but completely helpless. Zach Adams turned to him and made it clear they needed to get rid of her. Autry testified that Zach told him they had to take Holly to the river, a chilling phrase that immediately made Autry realize what was about to happen. He knew what taking someone to the river meant. It meant she wasn't coming back. Jason explained how he helped Zach load Holly into the back of a truck, still wrapped in the blanket. They drove to a remote area near the Tennessee River, a place secluded enough that no one would hear what was about to happen. Along the way, Jason claimed he was still in disbelief, trying to process what was happening. Then they stopped. Jason said that Zach pulled Holly out of the truck and laid her on the ground. He then handed Jason a gun and told him to finish the job. Jason admitted that he stepped forward, aimed the gun at Holly's head, and prepared to fire. But at the last second, something stopped him. He saw her move. Holly, barely conscious, let out a sound, some kind of plea, a cry, something that made Jason hesitate. He later said it was as if he realized, in that moment, that she was still a human being, not just a problem to get rid of. And in his hesitation, he made a decision. He wasn't going to be the one to pull the trigger. Jason claimed he turned to Zach and told him they needed to do something else. He suggested they leave and come back later after dark, when it would be easier to dispose of her body without being seen. They got back in the truck, but before they could leave, Jason claimed Zach did something he wasn't expecting. Without warning, Zach lifted the gun and fired. A single gunshot echoed through the air. Holly was dead. Jason described how he stood there, stunned, as Zach finished the job. There was no turning back now. Holly Bobo was gone, and they were the ones responsible. After the murder, Jason said they left her body near the river, planning to return later to properly dispose of it. But for reasons still unclear, Zach never followed through. Instead of dumping her into the river as they had planned, he, or someone else, moved her remains to another location in the woods, where they would stay hidden for more than 3 years. As Jason told his story, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. Holly's family listened as the details of their daughter's final moments were laid out in horrifying detail. It was the moment they had been dreading, the confirmation that Holly had suffered, that she had been aware of what was happening to her, that she had spent her last moments terrified and alone. But Jason's testimony did more than just reveal the truth. It provided prosecutors with what they needed most: direct, eyewitness testimony implicating Zach Adams as Holly's killer. Jason had admitted to being there. He had admitted to helping Zach move Holly's body. But the key takeaway from his testimony was clear. Zach Adams was the one who pulled the trigger. His testimony was a turning point in the trial. The jury listened to every word, knowing that this was the missing piece that tied everything together. Zach Adams had kidnapped Holly. He had held her against her will. And in the end, he had murdered her in cold blood. Autry's decision to testify wasn't just about saving himself. It was about ensuring that the man truly responsible for Holly's death face justice. And in the end, it worked. Jason Autry's words sealed Zach Adams' fate. The man who had once bragged about getting away with a perfect crime was now facing the consequences of his actions. For years, Holly Bobo's family had waited for justice. They had endured endless pain, the torment of not knowing what had happened to her, and the horror of discovering the truth through heartbreaking confessions and testimonies. They had sat in a courtroom, listening to the details of her abduction, her suffering, and her brutal murder. And now, after all the investigations, all the legal battles, and all the testimonies that had finally pieced together the nightmare Holly endured, the moment had arrived. The verdicts had been read, and sentencing was set. It was time for the men responsible for Holly's death to face the consequences of what they had done. The case against Zach Adams had been overwhelming. From the moment his brother Dylan Adams had confessed to seeing Holly in his home, to the chilling testimony of Jason Autry, the evidence had pointed directly to him as the mastermind behind Holly's abduction and murder. Prosecutors painted him as a violent, remorseless predator, a man who had spent years terrorizing his community, wrapped up in drugs and crime, until he finally committed an act so heinous it could never be undone. During the trial, Holly's parents, Dana and Karen Bobo, sat quietly in the courtroom, holding hands, bracing themselves for every detail. The weight of the evidence was crushing. There was no denying it now. Zach Adams had kidnapped Holly, tortured her, and ultimately ended her life with a gunshot to the head. The jury saw it. The prosecution proved it, and the defense had no way to explain it away. The moment came when the judge prepared to read Zach's sentence. The room was silent. Everyone knew what was coming, but hearing it out loud would make it real. Life in prison. Not just life, but life without the possibility of parole. And beyond that, an additional 50 years for other charges related to Holly's kidnapping and murder. For the Bobo family, it wasn't enough to undo what had been done. It wouldn't bring Holly back, but it meant that Zach Adams, the man who had taken everything from them, would never walk free again. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars, exactly where he belonged. But the sentencing didn't end with him. There were others involved, and they, too, had to face justice. Dylan Adams, Zach's younger brother, had played a different role in the crime. He wasn't the mastermind, he wasn't the trigger man, but he had knowledge of what happened, and for years he had stayed silent. He had withheld crucial information, allowing his brother to go free while the Bobo family suffered. Unlike Zach, Dylan took a plea deal. He agreed to plead guilty to charges of facilitating first-degree murder and kidnapping, avoiding a trial that could have resulted in a harsher sentence. For his role in the crime, Dylan Adams was sentenced to 35 years in prison. It wasn't life, and it wasn't as severe as what his brother received, but it was still a major victory for the prosecution. Dylan had spent years denying any involvement, pretending he knew nothing. Now, he had finally admitted the truth, and he would pay for his silence and complicity. The sentencing hearings were emotional. Holly's mother, Karen, stood in front of the court, her voice shaking but full of determination. She spoke directly to the men who had taken her daughter from her, telling them that they had stolen something precious from her family, something they could never get back. She described the pain of waking up every day without Holly, of missing her smile, her laughter, her presence. She spoke of the nightmares, the endless grief, the hole in their family that could never be filled. And then, with all the strength she could gather, she told Zach Adams and his accomplices that they had lost, that justice had finally caught up with them. For the Bobo family, there would never be full closure. No sentence could ever undo the horror of what had happened. But knowing that Zach Adams would die in prison, knowing that Dylan Adams would spend decades behind bars, knowing that those responsible for Holly's suffering would never again hurt another innocent person, there was a sense of relief in that. The courtroom was filled with emotion as the sentences were finalized. Some people wept, others simply sat in silence, absorbing the weight of the moment. For the prosecution, it was a hard-fought victory, one that had taken years to achieve. For Holly's loved ones, it was the closest thing to justice they would ever get. As Zach Adams was led away in handcuffs, there was no apology, no sign of remorse. He remained as cold and emotionless as he had been throughout the trial. But it didn't matter anymore. His fate was sealed. Holly Bobo had been stolen from the world far too soon. Her bright future snatched away by men who had no regard for human life. But in the end, justice prevailed. The men responsible had been named, tried, and sentenced. And though the Bobo family would forever feel the absence of their beloved Holly, they could finally say that those who had caused them so much pain would never walk free again. Even after the convictions of Zach Adams and his accomplices, there remained a cloud of mystery hanging over Holly Bobo's case. While the justice system had handed down sentences for the men directly involved in her death, some unsettling questions lingered in the air. The pieces of the puzzle were almost all in place, but not all of them fit perfectly. Despite the convictions, there were gaps in the timeline, uncertainties about the full extent of the crime, and hints that perhaps more people were involved than had been revealed. One of the most enduring mysteries that plagued the investigation was the role of other potential accomplices. While Zach Adams, Dylan Adams, and Jason Autry were arrested, tried, and convicted for Holly's abduction, murder, and subsequent disposal of her body, investigators and the Bobo family couldn't shake the feeling that there were others who might have known more or participated in some way. Some names had come up during the investigation, but they had never been fully pursued. Were there other individuals involved in Holly's death who had not yet been identified? For instance, there had been speculation about the involvement of other people from the same criminal circles as the Adams brothers. People who might have had knowledge of the crime, people who could have been complicit in the cover-up, or even people who had provided assistance in hiding the evidence. While the prosecution focused primarily on Zach, Dylan, and Jason, some believe that there could have been a larger network involved in Holly's disappearance, especially given the complexity of the crime and the time it took to find her remains. Moreover, during the investigation, there were moments when investigators uncovered disturbing information about Zach Adams's background and his connections. Zach had a history of violence and had been involved in the local drug trade for years. He was known to associate with dangerous people, and there were whispers that his criminal network may have extended farther than anyone realized. Were there other criminals in his circle who helped him carry out the crime, even if they weren't directly involved in the kidnapping or murder? The prosecution had not presented concrete evidence to support the involvement of additional individuals, but there was always the unsettling thought that Holly's case may not have been as straightforward as it seemed. Another aspect that remained unclear was the exact timeline of events on the day Holly was taken. Jason Autry's testimony had filled in some of the gaps, but there were still parts of the story that didn't fully add up. For example, it was widely believed that Holly was abducted in the early morning hours of April 13th, 2011, but the exact sequence of events after she was seen being led into the woods by Clint Bobo, her brother, was still somewhat shrouded in mystery. What exactly happened during the time she was held captive before she was killed? Autry's testimony painted a grim picture, but some believe that the true horror Holly endured before her death had not been fully revealed. What had she suffered during the hours she was in the hands of her captors? Were there details that, for one reason or another, had not come to light? There were also questions about the location of Holly's remains. While they had ultimately been found by hunters in a secluded area, there had been other places where her body might have been hidden, and investigators never ruled out the possibility that evidence could have been concealed in other parts of the surrounding woods or even elsewhere. Was it possible that the area where Holly's remains were discovered was just the tip of the iceberg, and that there were other undiscovered pieces of evidence waiting to be found? Despite the efforts to answer these lingering questions, there were also those who speculated that law enforcement had left certain leads unexplored. The case had been extraordinarily complex, and while the Bobo family had received some measure of justice with the convictions of Zach, Dylan, and Jason, there were still uncomfortable uncertainties surrounding the full scope of the crime. And then there was the question of why some of these details remained hidden for so long. Why had it taken 3 years for Holly's remains to be found? Why had the perpetrators of such a heinous crime been allowed to roam free for so long? These questions haunted the investigation, leaving people wondering whether there had been any missed opportunities to solve the case more quickly. Had law enforcement overlooked crucial evidence? Had there been instances of incompetence or delays in the search for Holly? Additionally, some wondered if there was any possibility of Holly having been a victim of a larger, organized crime ring, perhaps one involved in trafficking or other illicit activities. Though no such ring had been definitively proven to be behind her abduction, rumors swirled for years about possible connections to more far-reaching criminal operations. This theory, however, was never fully substantiated by the investigation. For Holly's family, these ongoing mysteries were a constant reminder of how much they had lost. Even though the people responsible for a murder had been brought to justice, the shadows of unanswered questions continued to follow them. No matter how much they tried to move forward, they couldn't shake the feeling that the full truth hadn't yet come to light. They still held out hope that, one day, they would have a clearer picture of everything that had happened to their beloved Holly. The knowledge that there were still unanswered questions kept them tethered to the pain of their loss, unable to fully escape the haunting uncertainties that remained. The story of Holly Bobo was one of both closure and confusion. While justice had been served in some ways, the case still left behind a trail of unanswered questions, a trail that may never fully disappear. Would the remaining mysteries ever be solved? Would new information come to light that could reveal the full extent of the crime? Only time would tell, but the Bobo family and the people who had followed the case so closely knew that Holly's story was far from over. The truth, in its entirety, had yet to be fully uncovered.